A Simplex converted to a Great Western Railway Prairie Tank Part 34, preparing to mount the boiler into the frames. Normally, in a miniature locomotive, the boiler is held in place to the frames using some angle, like this off the previous boiler, and this in turn is held in place to the frames with another piece of brass angle. This forms an expansion joint. You need an expansion joint because when the boiler gets hot, it expands considerably. So by having two pieces of brass angle at each side, it allows the boiler to move. In my opinion, this piece of angle should have been built into the boiler when it was silver soldered. But just like the water gauge top fitting that also wasn't silver soldered into the boiler, neither are the boiler mountings. This is the ash pan, and quite frankly it's rubbish. I've ground a bit of it away to see how it's going to fit. I think I'm going to make a new ash pan, but for the moment I'm going to use this one as a template to help fit the boiler into the frames. The ash pan isn't made as shown on the drawing, and there's not much distance at the rear of the ash pan between the ash pan and the grate. I have a plan to make a boiler mounting. First of all, I need to measure in the frames to see how much room there is between the frame stretcher and the rear axle box. I'm going to cut this piece of steel bar into two pieces, which will be 4.5 inches long. These two pieces of steel will be fastened to the frames at each side, and the boiler can just sit on them. As I'm going to use this ash pan as a template, I need to make sure that it fits the boiler correctly. Currently, the crossbar that supports the grate is preventing the fitting of this ash pan in the correct position. I think first of all though, I'll cut the pieces of steel. This is part number 1 of the 2 that I need, so it's over to the bandsaw to chop it to length. Once I'd cut the first piece of steel, I used that as a template to set the position of the other piece. This current bandsaw blade has been amazing. I've never had a bandsaw blade that's lasted quite as long as this one. Everything about this old bandsaw is fairly horrible, but it's always done the job, so I'm not complaining. Blackgates Engineering have the same model, and they've had that for years too, used on a daily basis for cutting bar stock and tubing. I could leave the pieces of steel like this, but no, I want them to follow the lines of the boiler. I marked out one piece of steel and cut the end off it like this, and I used the part that I cut off as a pattern to mark out the other end. I really didn't need to do this because when everything's bolted into the frames you won't see it. The idea being, of course, that these two pieces of steel will be held into the frames with two bolts and the boiler will sit on them. That's why I cut them as shown. My motto has always been, every part of the model you're making should be a model in itself. Now the time has come for a test fitting of the boiler into the frames, and the ash pan is currently held in place by the dump pin. Called as such because when you pull out this pin, the ash pan drops, dumping all the ashes onto the ground. This new boiler is a very snug fit in between these frames. It was initially too wide. The boiler bushes that support the blowdown valves wouldn't let it go into the frames. So I had to grind down these two bushes until they fitted. There are two of them, one at each side. In this clip you can clearly see that the blowdown valve bush is almost in the centre of the hole in the frames. That is encouraging because if the bushes hadn't have lined up with the holes in the frames, that would have been a major problem. But even though the bushes line up perfectly with the holes in the frames, I do think that perhaps the boiler isn't perfectly level, but I'm not bothered about this. Great Western engines generally had taper boilers that tapered towards the front. Take a close look at this image. The only thing that's telling me that the boiler is leaning towards the front are the positions relative to the frame of the bottom row of rivets on the firebox. At the moment the engine is sat at the side of the bench and it's not in a good position to work on. When I start to fit the boiler properly, I'll move it round to the part of the bench where I normally work. And it also needs to be there for a while because I have to put all the mechanical problems right with the rolling chassis. In this clip I've removed the boiler from the frames, and with my Proxon motor tool, fitted with a very aggressive diamond cutter, I'm grinding away two cutouts, one at each side, which will accommodate the crossbar that supports the grate. Controlling this diamond cutter at this sort of a speed is very difficult, and I'm having to really hold on to the drill. The cutter is really wanting to dance about all over the place. Eventually that was one side done. The next job is to turn the boiler over, mark out the other side and do exactly the same at the other side. I hope these are in the right place because it's not good fun using this cutter. and if they're not in the right place, I will once again have to use the cutter to elongate them. This process is not damaging the boiler in any way, as the copper that I'm grinding away is only the surplus piece of inner firebox that protrudes below the foundation ring. After putting the boiler back in the frames on top of the ash pan, I do believe it's gone slightly lower. I'm not doing anything permanent in this episode, I'm just checking the alignment at the moment. It is essential that the chimney is vertical on the smoke box and aligns perfectly with the dome behind it. A while back I made a video series when I modified a Chinese 14XX Great Western locomotive. And when I first bought this engine, I was really horrified to see that the dome wasn't in line with the chimney, and that is not going to be the case with this Simplex. I'll be checking the alignment every step of the way. Before fitting the boiler, the smoke box will be securely bolted to the saddle, but the saddle will be the last thing to bolt into the frames. I will align the boiler to the chimney when I fit the boiler permanently into the frames. And that's a fair way off yet. I will have to fit the boiler cladding first. I will show how I do this in a future episode. It's time for me to go as I need to do some Christmas shopping. Merry Christmas, stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.